following the astounding success of EMD's revolutionary GP7 locomotive, EMD's engineering department began working towards a successor, the 1750 horsepower GP9, in January 1954. This updated locomotive would house a 567C prime mover. As part of the campaign for the new locomotive, quite a number of EMD's new GP9s were built as part of a replacement order program, beginning what was known as the second generation of diesel power on some railroads. This program allowed railroads to turn in their older locomotives, such as their FT road locomotives, and receive credit towards new GP9s, often a third off list price and a tax credit. Some parts off the older FT locomotives, such as the trucks, traction motor frames, batteries, engine crankshaft, water pumps, camshaft cylinder, test valves, blower, and auxiliary generators, were able to be transferred into the new locomotives. The 1750 horsepower GP9 was an updated version of the highly successful GP7, which it closely resembles. However, the GP9 contained many internal improvements. Internal changes included a vastly improved wheel slip control system, replacing the D27 traction motors with those of a D37 designation, and increasing the RPM of the 567 engine from 800 RPM to 835 for the new 567C engine. While the GP9s closely resembled the GP7s, which they were essentially an updated version of, their initial work assignments on the B&M were vastly different from those of their older GP7 kin. While the GP7s had been assigned primarily to local freight and initially secondary passenger runs, the newer GP9s and later the GP18s were used mostly as heavy-duty road freight power when they arrived, as they were replacements for the older 4200 series freight diesels. As the years wore on, work assignments for the GP7s, the newer GP9s, and other road locomotives became more intermingled. The Boston and Maine indulged in this replacement program, turning in their well-used FT locomotives towards new GP9s. By the time the McGuinness administration came into power in the mid-1950s, the original 4200 series FT units were worn out and due for a mid-life overhaul or replacement. Unlike with later model units, their internal technology was obsolete and incompatible with that of newer units. Many components of the F2s, F3s, F7s, and GP7s were all interchangeable. However, the components of the older FT locomotives were compatible only with FT locomotives. Although the newest FTs were merely a dozen years old, they ultimately found themselves being replaced. At the time, the manufacturer, EMD, offered what they euphemistically termed an FT to GP9 upgrade program. In reality, this program was nothing more than the act of trading in older units which were scrapped at McCook, Illinois, next door to EMD. A small number of components were salvaged from the FT locomotives, reconditioned, and incorporated into the new replacement locomotives. There has ever since been myths and misconceptions that the older locomotives were somehow converted into modern, unrecognizable locomotives, in this case GP9s. The likelihood of any components from the traded-in locomotives actually making it into its replacement locomotive would be in most cases purely coincidental and by chance, as the parts entered a general pool from which they were drawn from. Some of the components reused on the replacement locomotives were the truck frames, engine block, traction motors, compressor, batteries if satisfactory after being tested, auxiliary generator, reverser, and voltage regulator. All of these components would be completely reconditioned before being assembled into the new locomotives. The first 5 FT A and B pairs, 4202, 4204, 4212, 4216, and 4209A, 4206B, left the B&M property in November and December 1956, and allegedly returned beginning from March 1957 as 1750 horsepower GP9s 1700 through 1709. The first 4 GP9s, 1700 through 1703, in Boston on March 5th, entering service on Boston to Worcester Freight BW1 the following evening. As difficult as it may seem to visualize, the use of radios for railroad communications was in its infancy when the 1700s were delivered in 1957. At this time, communications on through freights continued to be accomplished with hand signals. Ultimately, the GP9s were delivered without radios. Installation of Motorola 30-watt radios on the 1700s began in earnest a year later in the summer of 1958, with large numbers of road cabooses equipped accordingly at the same time. By September of that year, it was announced that all through freight trains were equipped with radios. At the time, this application was limited to communications between locomotive and caboose, and members of the crew on the ground, and also between different trains when within short distances of each other. Communications between trains and wayside stations, including train dispatchers many miles away, would come later. Interestingly, where radios were first used in yard switching, they were used only for communicating between yardmasters' offices and locomotives. The ground crews involved in switching did not have portable radios at this time. Elsewhere on the B&M, radios were slow to make inroads. When Doug Kidd hired out on the B&M 20 years later in 1977, the Bud RDCs in passenger service were still not equipped with radios. The most noticeable difference from the older units were, to the casual observer, the striking new paint scheme, termed the Bluebird scheme by rail fans. The new intertwined B and M insignia, designed by Herbert Matter, and the new blue colors rapidly became one of New England's most recognizable trademarks. Already 1,050-foot boxcars were delivered in this scheme in 1956, with 539 new 40-foot boxcars to display a variation in 1957. Anywhere on the B&M, one could see the new B&M insignia, whether it was on the Bud RDCs, on the side of the 720-foot-long Bud House at Boston Engine Terminal, or in microscopic form printed on single-ride tickets. The image of the Boston and Maine had changed, and for the highly noticeable. Regardless of what traditionalists thought of the new colors, B&M had put forth the image that they had moved into the jet age. The GP9s were the largest block of road engines owned by the B&M of the GP type. The original purchase was for 50 engines, and they were delivered between February and December of 1957. All the GP9s were delivered with dynamic brakes and winterization hatches. Since the 1700s were intended for road freight service, they were equipped with dynamic brakes. Their cabs were equipped with an ice box and radio, items always present on outbound units, though often at the expense of other units standing in engine terminals. The short hood, aside from its customary one-holer toilet, contained a large block of concrete ballast in place of a steam generator. By December 1957, all 50 of B&M's new GP9s had arrived. Despite being state-of-the-art locomotives, it's interesting to note that some of the Boston and Maine GP9s were picked up from the manufacturer by Nickel Plate Road Berkshire steam locomotives, which were still in service on the Nickel Plate Road at that time. While the GP9s were capable of general-purpose use, the lion's share of the work they performed in their early years was in multiple lash-ups of 2, 3, and 4 units, running on the heaviest cross-country freight trains from Portland to New York State. The 1700s initially entered service on the Boston to Mechanicville, New York, Portland to Worcester, and Portland to Mechanicville main lines, and ruled these lines exclusively through the arrival of the GP18s until 1963 or 1964. Thereafter, the retirement of cab units and Alcos altered engine assignments or perhaps maintenance tended to render all units the same. This is not to say that they never hauled local freights or they never were used on passenger trains during that early time period. At the time, numerous summertime camp extras were operated between Worcester and Portland on the Boston and Maine. The GP9s were frequently seen on these assignments, sometimes pulling seemingly endless strings of Pullman sleeping cars from an incredible assortment of different railroads. GP9s provided passenger service for other rare instances as well. The February 26, 1972 very last snow train excursion to North Conway, the blizzard of 1978, the period in which the Boston and Maine was supplying power to the MBTA commuter trains out of North Station, and the Boston and Maine's brief South Side commuter operations out of South Station. Whatever the result was, in later years the GP9 truly became a system engine. It is interesting to note that by the end of the 1960s, when the GP9s were just a dozen or so years old, they were said to have more mileage on them than the older GP7s, which preceded them by between 3 to 7 years. Although the GP9s were uncommon on local freights and branch line trains in the first 10 years of their operations on the Boston and Maine, there were exceptions to the rule. Several Bluebirds did make journeys out on the branch lines. When this happened, it usually included a GP9 that had pulled a mainline freight into a terminal city like Boston, Concord, New Hampshire, Manchester, or Mechanicville, and then was cut off the power and assigned to, or snagged by, a local freight crew. The corporate bankruptcy of the Boston and Maine Railroad in 1970 saw commonplace assignments of power become less standard, and locomotives tended to move around with a bit more leniency. From 1970 onward, the GP9s became extremely frequent on branch line trains, while still forming a main portion of the Boston and Maine's mainline power pool. It seemed that in the 1970s, the GP9s could be found practically anywhere the imagination or a photographer could travel on the Boston and Maine, on local freights in Manchester, Goffstown, or Topsfield, pulling freight to the St. Regis paper mill in Pepperell, on the gravel train from Ossipee, pulling freight extras through Epping bound for Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant. The list goes on and on and on. The arrival of brand new EMD GP38-2 locomotives in 1973 only increased the presence of GP9 on smaller freights, yet as the 70s continued, GP9s, GP7s, GP18s, and GP38s all shared mainline duties. The years leading up to and after the bankruptcy also saw the number of wrecks on the Boston and Maine increase dramatically as the cash-strapped railroad struggled to maintain its right-of-way. In the late 60s and early 70s, the Boston and Maine was known to have a Wreck of the Week, and photographs of such destructive events were taken at North Chelmsford, Clinton, Orange, and even in the Hoosick Tunnel. Nearly all of these incidents were without loss of life, but certainly harmed the Boston and Maine's financial and reputation status. The fleet of B&M's GP9s, or 1700s as they were to become known by employees, remained intact until locomotives 1710 and 1735 were wrecked at Ashtabula, Ohio in September 1968. The next GP9 to leave the roster was locomotive 1713, following a collision in North Berwick, Maine on April 21, 1972. More accidents claimed the lives of GP9s, and 1740 in a famous fire in the Boston yards in the spring of 1980 involving a hazardous railroad car. The incident, which claimed Boston and Maine 1740, occurred on Thursday morning, April 3, 1980. 1740, being used as a switcher in Somerville, collided with a tank car of phosphorus trichloride, puncturing the tanker car, creating a chemical spill. The tanker car had been filled with chemicals for Monsanto, located nearby. The incident was exacerbated when the fire department poured water on the chemical, creating a cloud, which injured up to 100 people due to chemical exposure. By the time of the Guilford Industries takeover in June 1983, one more GP9, class leader 1700, had been set aside, not to wreck, but to mechanical issues. 1702 was torched at White River Junction during the first Guilford strike in 1986. The most tragic accident involving a B&M GP9 occurred on August 11, 1981. 4 men, including a rail fan riding in the locomotive, perished when locomotive 1731 collided with a passenger train at Pride's Crossing in Beverly, Massachusetts. A number of GP9s were involved in spectacular accidents that did not necessitate their retirements. One such accident did, however, take the life of engineer John Ginepra when a train headed by several 1700s hit a mudslide and derailed at Shawsheen Village on June 12, 1965. The lead locomotive, number 1748, overturned, mortally wounding the engineer, who died in a hospital a few hours later. 1748 was repaired and subsequently returned to service on the Boston Maine. Taking a look at some of these photos, one might notice that the GP9s involved in the wrecks are often jackknifed in different directions. This had to do with the use of dynamic braking having an effect on the coupler boxes. It was the wreck at the Hoosick Tunnel's eastern end which ended the use of dynamic braking on the Boston and Maine, with the dynamic brakes in the GP9s being deactivated and the dynamic brake fans being removed and plated over. On August 2, 1979, locomotives 1725 and 1726, along with a DW&P RS-11, overturned when they encountered a washout in Chicopee, Massachusetts. Both units were extensively rebuilt, sparking the 1800 rebuild program, which we will mention later. Cosmetically, the Boston and Maine's GP9s wore a variety of different paint schemes. They were, of course, delivered in the classic blue, black, and white paint of the McGuinness administration, which came to be known as the Bluebird scheme by railfans. In the late 60s and early 70s, the Boston and Maine began painting its locomotives in a simplified blue paint scheme, sometimes called Blue Dip or Bankruptcy Blue by railfans. This paint first started appearing on Alco RS3 and EMD GP7s beginning in 1967. As hype for the nation's bicentennial mounted in the mid-1970s, the B&M painted a number of units up in tribute paint schemes, receiving red, white, and blue stripes on the nose. The GP9s to receive this were the 1715, 1716, 1719, 1729, and 1737. The striping on the 1715 and 1729 were a bit straighter, and the rest of the units had more of a diagonal angle to the striping. For the bicentennial, a number of Boston and Maine GP9s also received a silhouette of the famous Minuteman logo on the nose. In 1978 and 1979, the Boston and Maine began painting the stepwells on their locomotives orange to increase the visibility of the steps in yards and increase safety for crews. This was a short-lived effort and didn't last beyond 1980 or 1981. Around this time, several Boston and Maine GP9s also received strobe beacons on their cabs, but these were also short-lived. In 1979, the Boston and Maine received a poorly mixed batch of blue paint that turned out to be too dark, and only a handful of locomotives were painted with that paint. Ultimately, this darker paint peeled quickly and weathered, and some of the Boston and Maine locomotives painted with this paint received sort of an unruly look, although very quickly they were repainted. Just prior to its demise in an incident in 1980, Boston and Maine 1740 was painted in an interesting paint scheme, featuring the lettering on the cab instead of the long hood, and the Boston and Maine logo on the side of the short hood. Finally, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Boston and Maine adopted its last corporate paint scheme. This was another simplified blue scheme, which was dubbed the Dustin scheme by the railfan community in honor of the Boston and Maine's president at that time, Alan Dustin. This usually consisted of a darker blue closer to Conrail blue, but there were a few different shades. It also consisted of the words Boston and Maine spelled out on the long hood in white lettering, and either a white nose stripe up the front or the letters BM on the nose. This paint scheme originally included a white sill stripe, but by the early 1980s, the sills were instead being painted black. Despite the different paint schemes worn by the Boston and Maine GP9s from the 1960s to the 1980s, several GP9s that were in good mechanical condition did not need to be overhauled and repainted. And because of this, a handful clung on to their original Bluebird paint into the late 1970s and even early 1980s. The last two GP9s still wearing the original paint were the 1749 and the 1733. The 1749 was repainted first, leaving the 1733 to soldier on as the final Bluebird until May 1981, when it was finally repainted. Concurrently, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Boston and Maine began a plan to upgrade and refurbish its GP9 fleet to higher horsepower standards. The railroad was hoping that by doing this to its existing locomotive fleet, the Boston and Maine, which was just beginning to emerge from bankruptcy, might avoid needing to purchase new power. The rebuild program saw the locomotives have their prime movers updated, and the locomotives that were refurbished carried new numbers in the 1800 series. Ultimately, 9 GP9s and 1 GP18, the 1750, went through the rebuild program, exchanging their 1700 series numbers for 1800 series numbers, but retaining the last 2 digits of their original numbers. Unlike as on other railroads, none of the rebuilds had their noses chopped, but they retained their high short hoods until they were retired. GP9 1825 was the first such unit to be rebuilt, being outshopped in September 1980. The Boston and Maine had planned to do this to all of their GP9s, although history would intervene. The new GP9s carried the designation GP9R. The GP9 still made up a majority of the Boston and Maine's diesel fleet, as the railroad itself became a part of history, sold to Guilford Transportation Industries in 1983. Guilford adopted a stark new paint scheme of dark gray and orange, which began appearing on locomotives in the early 1980s, and also renamed and renumbered their locomotives into the Springfield Terminal designation and gave them new double-digit numbers. However, some of the Boston and Maine GP9s under Guilford ownership were never painted out of their Boston and Maine paint schemes. What began as an optimistic merger soon took on dubious overtones, as it became clear that Guilford was less interested in operating the Boston and Maine as it was, and began to consolidate and retire lines and equipment. In 1987, and again in 1995, Guilford went on scrapping binges, scrapping a large amount of Boston and Maine diesels, including many GP7s and GP9s. These scrapping efforts, along with tales of mismanagement, disgruntled employee strikes, and relatively poor service, continued to mark Guilford's reputation as the 1990s came on. As a new millennium approached, a number of Boston and Maine GP9s remained in service, although this number seemed to shrink as the years went by. Occasionally, however, trains led by 2 or 3 GP9s operated on the lines in Maine, and it was not uncommon to see Boston and Maine GP9s still in service on Guilford and eventually Pan Am railways. Into the 2010s, a number were still in service, and finally, in the latter half of the 2010s, only 3 Boston and Maine GP9s remained in service on Pan Am railways. These were number 52, 72, and 77. The 52 had been built as Boston and Maine 1726, later upgraded and renumbered 1826 after the wreck at Chicopee, Massachusetts. The 77 had been built as Boston and Maine 1738, later upgraded to 1838. The 72 had been built as 1741 and had been rebuilt to GP18 standards following a wreck in the 1970s, but was not part of the rebuild program and so never had its number changed. Around 2011, 52 and 77 had been surprisingly painted in heritage colors, the 52 in the Maine Central's green and yellow, and the 77 in the Boston and Maine's classic maroon and yellow. While these paint schemes undeniably looked gorgeous on these Springfield Terminal locomotives, neither paint scheme was original to the Boston and Maine GP9s. Certainly the Maine Central scheme was not, and the Boston and Maine GP9s never wore the maroon and gold, having been delivered in the McGuinness blue, black, and white. The 52, the 72, and the 77 continued to work with interest, while the 51, the 62, and the 71 languished and were scrapped in the Waterville deadline around 2017. In the late 2010s, news surprised the railfan community that the 3 GP9s had been acquired by the Heber Valley Railroad of Utah. The 52 and 77 departed for their new home, eventually being renumbered 5926 and 5938 respectively, the last 2 digits harkening back to their original Boston and Maine numbers. As of 2024, the 5926 has been repainted in a Rio Grande inspired paint scheme, and plans are for the 5938 to receive the same. Springfield Terminal 72, still in its dingy Springfield Terminal Guilford paint, lingered at Waterville and was supposed to head out west as well. The 470 Railroad Club worked with the Heber Valley Railroad to acquire the locomotive, trading some funds and parts in exchange for the GP9. The 72, former Boston and Maine 1741, made its way to the Conway Scenic Railroad in North Conway, where it began preparation for restoration. 2 more GP9s are known to have survived into recent years. Boston and Maine 1728, which later became the 66, and 1732, which later became the 68, led a nomadic life throughout New England and beyond. Both units spent brief time on the Naugatuck Railroad in Connecticut, and the 1728 or 66 also went to the Massachusetts Central Railroad, and later to the Raritan Central Railway in New Jersey. The 1728 was sold to Larry's Truck and Electric in Ohio in recent years. The 1732, or Springfield Terminal 68, has a bit more of a positive history. It stayed at the Naugatuck Railroad in Connecticut, becoming part of the Railroad Museum of New England's collection. After spending brief time in excursion service painted in the early 1970s Blue Dip, it was sidelined for engine troubles and is currently awaiting restoration at their shops in Connecticut. The 1732 and the 1741 are the only 2 original Boston and Maine GP9s still remaining in New England. Surprisingly enough, there are 2 more B&M GP9s which still survive, sort of. And strangely enough, they are the 1710 and 1735, the 2 GP9s which were lost in the wreck of the coal train in Ashtabula, Ohio in 1968. After being returned to the Boston and Maine, the remains were sent out west to be rebuilt as GP10s in Paducah, Kentucky. The 1710 reemerged as Illinois Central 8270. After changing hands a few times over the years, the 8270 has most recently been Red River Valley and Western number 404. The 1735 reemerged as Illinois Central Gulf number 8303. Most recently, the unit operated as Paducah and Louisville 8303. The Bluebird paint scheme hasn't graced an original Boston and Maine locomotive in 43 years since the last unit, 1733, was repainted in May 1981. But all that is changing now on the far stretches of the Boston and Maine system in the village of North Conway, New Hampshire, nestled deep in the Mount Washington Valley. Here in this town, once served by the Boston and Maine and Bluebird GP9s in the early 1970s, a survivor persists. We visited the Conway Scenic Railroad in January 2024, where Corey Fothergill of the 470 Railroad Club gave us a tour of Boston and Maine 1741.
All right, we acquired this from the Heber Valley probably 5 years ago at this point. And to initiate the process, we actually were interested in saving a B&M GP9. We were trying to get one of the heritage engines, the 52 or the 77. And that really didn't work out for us. The Heber Valley wanted them out west, and they moved pretty quick from Waterville. 72 stayed at Waterville for a little bit. It didn't have any traction motors. It didn't have wheels to ship by rail under it. So we reached back out to the Heber Valley. They were very good working with the 470 Club. We were able to come up with a deal that worked for both of us, where we traded parts and money to acquire this, to get the costs down to get this engine. So it worked out pretty well. It took about a year of negotiating back and forth, and we were able to settle a deal. We got them their parts, and Pan Am was very good to us. They helped us get wheels under this so we could get it shipped by rail to North Conway. Shipped by rail down to Danville Junction. The St. Lawrence Atlantic brought it to Groveton, and at that point we weren't open for the season, so the locomotive continued to North Stratford, where Ed Jeffries stored it for us at the North Stratford facility. And in the spring, when the Groveton branch reopened, the New Hampshire Central brought this into us. We're very lucky. They worked with us. New Hampshire Central donated the storage, the transportation for us. So that's very generous of them. And we're lucky that Pan Am worked with us as well. They helped get this prepped and ready to ship. And once we finished the 4268, we jumped right into this, and this is the point we're at now. The end goal is to have this a blue-carded operational engine that the Conway Scenic can count on a daily basis to operate the trains, most likely the Valley trains, unless we get it fancy, we get the dynamics working again. But most certainly it'll help them on the Valley trains between Conway and Sawyers River. And it's a little bit easier to use than the F units on a day-to-day basis. You only need one versus having the two back-to-back. And it'll just give them more versatility. They'll have more power. In this day and age, it's hard to get parts sometimes. It takes a little bit longer. Ever since COVID, people's supply chains are down. There's not a lot of help out there. So when we lose a part on one of our engines, sometimes instead of taking a week to get a part, it could take a month and a half. So at this point in time, there's nothing better than having an extra locomotive sitting on your property ready to go. If we need 4 for our daily operations, it's ideal to have 6 serviceable or 7 serviceable. And just like all the other engines here at North Conway, we're fortunate all these first generation EMDs, they all share parts with each other as well. So on a side note, we've been building up quite a supply of parts mechanically, electrically, to have on hand so we can better keep these in service without having wait time for getting parts in. So yeah, it'll definitely be helpful here to have as another daily operational engine. Yeah. So this, pretty much the inside of this, the cab here is original from when the engine was built. The only upgrades that would be really noticeable would be the electric speedometers. We just put the electric cab heaters in. It still had the original water cab heaters from the factory. Yep. But really they went their whole life original. Nothing was modified. The ditch lights were added on. That was a new circuit that was put into here. It's still the original 24 brake. This engine's kind of special. This is the only one I came across on Pan Am towards the end here, and this has actually got maintaining added onto it, which they didn't really have on any of theirs. But yeah, the sidewall heaters were added in here, and the same factory seats from back when B&M got them in the 1950s. Yeah. Yeah, like the pictures on the walls, I mean, those are original from 1950. The
interior paint, kind of.
Yeah, this is gray now, but there's patches somewhere in here. But originally, this would have been. You might be able to see on the wall here. How's it going? This has got some green in here, but that's essentially when it gets restored. Once we fix some of the cosmetic blemishes, it'll go back to the original green. Yep. Everything back here on the wall. I don't know, this one does still have the selector switch. So this would have been, when they came from the factory, the original setup for the dynamic brakes, and you'd set it to what position the locomotive was. This is number 1, 2, 3, or 4. And that would regulate the current coming through the MU cables to decide how much braking power the engine would have. Yep. So you would have to have these set up right to to make things work. This is the electrical cabinet. This was updated. I can look on the wall. I believe it was 1976 or 78. They rewired this engine. Everything, all the power contactors are now electric instead of pneumatic, which made them a lot more reliable. They got rid of all the braking circuits, so it's a very simple engine inside, which B&M at the time was doing that to make them last longer. That was their version of an upgrade, essentially making it to a GP18 standard. So we're pretty lucky in that sense. The wiring's in really good shape. Can probably get you by this. This engine's got the original, it's a 567C block. We just got done changing power assembly number 11. And we've been cleaning the engine room up because this has been such a mess over the years with exhaust leaks. But other than about 4 power assemblies, everything's from 1978 when they last rebuilt it. So we'll continue to go through and upgrade anything we find weak, anything that fails a compression test or gets low on a compression test, anything that's blowing excessive oil. We've gone through and done a lot of the water jumpers on this. Almost every single one of them was leaking from sitting so long, so everything, new O-rings have been put on everything. But yeah, the goal is keeping it clean in here. The longer you control all the oil leaks and the water leaks, the longer the engine will last, and keep the electrical dry and out of oil, and from chafing on stuff, and these things will last forever. Guess we go around to the end.
Frankenstein compartment.
Yeah, we're not really sure what this compartment does, but it was added on by Guilford for some function at some point in time, hydraulic or flange lubricator. We're not really sure. Your guess is as good as ours, but this will be removed. We'll weld metal back on here to make it look normal. You can kind of see some of the blemishes on the front of the nose where it's bowed out here. So obviously sheet metal was replaced here down or from there up at one point in time. You can see the difference here from the front headlight. This one's actually up about 3 inches from the bottom of the number board, so that's how it should be. Yeah. Obviously the walkways and such will be replaced at some point in time, but yeah, you can definitely tell it's had a lot of sheet metal work done to it since the factory. It's been in a lot of accidents for sure.
When you do the new number board housings, now those were individual panels versus the full panel?
Yeah, so that's what Wayne's working on. We're working on the table over here, but the original housings would have slots, and you'd put which number the locomotive was into the slots, and we're going to return that to original, to the 1741. Yep. This end's set up for it. The front end, somebody had stolen it out of it, so we're going to weld in the boxes over here to the front end to make the front end look like it was from the factory as well.
We have the panels from the 1734 in the archives, I think.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, but yeah, they're individual numbers. Sometimes some of them, you look at the old pictures and there's like a couple of them missing.
Yeah, so they just kind of float in there. So like when these engines got in derailments, or if somebody made a really hard hitch, they technically could fall out of place in there, and they just slide in from the rear. Yep. The marker lights are, all the marker lights are still intact on this engine. They have the green and the red plates to change the class. So those will all be working too. I can kind of show you those housings over on the back. This is a good view here. I guess you can see the footboards originally would have come out of these pilot plates here. And those were all removed, what, in the 70s or so, right around then?
Probably early 70s. They're still probably doing it after they weren't supposed to.
Yep. And this end, just like the other end, there's no alignment control, so the couplers have a lot more play than a normal locomotive. This is part of the reasons with the issues they had with the dynamic brakes on the B&M without alignment couplers, and lots of head-end braking forces. When you hit bad track, they start to do weird things, and that's why the GP9s, when they derail, they'd all be in zigzag patterns. The couplers would all shift, and similar to a train derailment we saw, what was it, this summer, the one out west on NS, where they blamed it on lack of alignment couplers.
1744, I get pictures of laid over on her side out at Charlemont because of dynamic braking.
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Yep.
I don't know if that's what happened in Clinton, but they sure were all zigzag.
Zigzagged. Yep. Yeah, it's common occurrence in all of them. This is the number board assemblies. This would have come out of the North Coast 1757. We had saved part of the hood of it. So we cut them out because they're welded in from the factory behind the regular number boards. And each position would hold a number, so you could have 4 numbers on these. I think Southern Pacifics were a little bit longer. They had 5 numbers.
This one has the EMD part number right there.
So we have the EMD part number even. You can put it on the inventory list of all of our parts.
These were Penzi originally, right?
Yeah, so that would have been out of the 7083, I think it was. Pens, they all shared the same parts, so.
Yeah, you can see they just slide in the brackets, hold them in place.
Yeah, over the years, a lot of railroads cut them out, simplified it. They just hang 2 bulbs instead of 3, and then they weren't using those style number boards anymore. I actually believe the original ones, we have some, the outer portion was actually glass, it wasn't plexiglass. The problem with these is, and we'll probably use glass on this, but when you use plexi, it only lasts for like 5 to 10 years, and then it chalks up and you can't read the numbers. Yep. So that's why a lot of railroads just did away with them and just did solid number boards. I guess I can show you guys a little more. All the wheels under this engine, we had to change everything out because we had idler wheels under it when it arrived. The trucks, you can read the builder's plate on this. So Wayne, this would have been what turned in from an FT or an older F unit. So this builder's plate on this truck shows 4 of 1953, and it doesn't mean it was a Boston Maine engine specifically. It was whatever was at EMD when they were building these engines. They turned them in to reduce the outright cost of buying these. Both these trucks are probably original to this engine. So we installed traction motors and what we call a combo traction motor with a wheel on it. We built them out in the yard here, and these are as big of wheels as you can possibly put under an engine. They're fat 40s. The rim thickness is about 3 1/4 inches. Hence this engine sits very high. I mean, the B&M probably didn't have wheels under it that big about once in its life. Yeah. It's the tallest engine we got here. It just barely clears the beam coming in the roundhouse. It's made its way through it now, so it fits.
Cleared its own path.
I don't know if the lighting will show here. We've had the main generator apart. This is where it had a fire on Pan Am, and a lot of times these engines have fires here. It's essentially an oil catch pan under the motor. And what happens is the drains clog up, everything gets soaked in oil and it backs up, and then your wiring soaks in oil. And the traction motor leads here were heavily soaked in oil and had bad insulation in a spot, and eventually it burnt through and it started a fire. The generator at this point in time, from what we've tested, is going to be okay. The traction motor leads are not. We've removed them, and we'll pull new cable through for that one set of motors. And hopefully that's the extent of the damage. We'll find out more once we start testing, but from right now, that's all we're aware of. And again, more on when we start doing the cosmetic restoration here. Some of the parts on here are just whatever they could find to put this engine together. The handrail stanchions here, the bolt together style, is from a GP7. So at some point they probably lost the handrails on this portion of the engine, and that's what was on hand at Billerica or Waterville, and that's what they put on. So we do have the correct handrails. One of the handrails over there is bent. We'll replace those before we do any paint work to it. We want to make sure it looks right again. The pilot heights have to be modified because this is so high off the rail at this point because of the big wheels. We have to bring the pilots down lower to make sure they meet the FRA requirements to get them under 6 inches.
It's funny with these Jeeps, you know, there are a lot more pictures of some of them than others.
Yep.
But then once you start diving into it, they come out of the woodwork.
Yeah, we've come across so many of this. Well, from the ones you found on the Conway branch,
yeah.
it was up here a lot, the gravel train, Farmington switcher.
Portsmouth a little bit.
Yeah.
Shots of it on C9 or 10 coming through Bow from Concord South.
Yep.
So that means it would have gone to Manchester, then out over the Portsmouth branch to Portsmouth. So
wow.
we know it did that. So it was everywhere.
Yeah, it kind of got all over the system. Yeah, we were lucky when we got this from Waterville. We kind of hinted around and asked the superintendent up there. We said, any chance you get the print for this?
Yeah.
And they said, give us a few minutes, we'll go take a look. And they rolled out a print and it said right on it, 72, 1741. You can roll the print out. It's about 30 feet long and it shows every single wire. It's not even like a schematic. It actually shows where every wire should be on a footprint in here. And it matches the engine. We're very lucky because a lot of times these engines get heavily modified over the years from one railroad to another.
Yep.
And you get it in, for example, like our 1751 out here, it's been to 3 different railroads, 3 different electricians in charge of it.
Standards of doing things.
So you just don't know how some of the circuits have run and what they chose to do with it. So, but this engine, we're lucky. We do have the print and it matches the print very closely.
Yep.
So it's helpful troubleshooting this, and for like what I'm doing right now today, we'll be rewiring the number boards and the class lights and the headlight.
Yeah.
And I'll know exactly how much wire to pull through and where I'm running it to.
So what did you say was the general timeline for work, the things you're doing coming up?
The next step in the process here is replacing the number 3 traction motor leads.
Yep.
We're going to get batteries ordered, so we have decent batteries to do more field testing. We have at least 1 cylinder head that's got valve issues that we're chasing down that we're going to change out. And after that point, once we've got those ironed out, reconnecting the new electric cab heaters, and it would be put out in the field and tested. The 2-year air brake is complete, so it's signed off for that on the blue card. It's technically had a 92-day test. It's gone through all the filters. We've done everything underneath to every single traction motor that needs to be done. We're hopeful that in the next 2 to 3 months we can have this on a train out here in the yard and testing it. And the goal would be we want to run test it a few times before we pull it back in to do the cosmetic restoration. We might start tinkering on some body panel replacement, but we want to make sure this runs before we paint it, because you can still change stuff even if it's painted. But then it makes things a little trickier, when you're rubbing up against car body doors and stuff that have a really nice paint job. It really, you really have to put a little more time into it than right now. But we're hopeful this year we can have this done and get this painted. We always get ongoing work to keep the F units happy. But essentially, once these 3 are done, then we can focus on the next goal would be restoring the wreck train once that arrives here. And there will be some effort to get the wreck train here still too. We still have to do a little bit of air brake work to that, but as long as the railroads continue to cooperate, they've been very good to us and should be able to see that this summer too.
And you said the official decision is to put this into delivery paint?
So this will be, once it's fully restored, it'll be an as-delivered paint. Yep.
There are many moving pieces, no pun intended, that make up a railroad. Locomotives are a major piece of that equation, and certain locomotives carry with them legendary status for their respective railroads. Although other Boston and Maine diesels, like the F units or the switchers, certainly represented the railroad well, it's hard to think of a diesel locomotive more recognized and tied into the name of the Boston and Maine than the Bluebird GP9s. They ushered in a new corporate image on the railroad that came to rival the famous Minuteman and Maroon and Gold in fame and recognition. The 50 units combined racked up more mileage than any other diesel class on the Boston and Maine, hands down, and a handful of them served for nearly 60 years in their home territory. There are very few miles of the former Boston and Maine system that never played host to a GP9 at one point in time, be it for local freight service, maintenance of way extra service, mainline road freight, or even rare passenger extras. Thanks to the restoration of Boston and Maine 1741 by the 470 Railroad Club at North Conway, New Hampshire, a Boston and Maine Bluebird will remain a presence on the former Boston and Maine system for the foreseeable future. For those of us my age that were born long after the Bluebird paint scheme vanished on the Boston and Maine in 1981, this is an important history lesson. After seeing so many photos and Kodachrome slides of these locomotives, and always feeling somewhat separated from that history which carried an almost mythical air, it's a very surreal and rewarding thought to see those images up close in person. We'd like to thank the 470 Railroad Club and Corey Fothergill for allowing us to come up and access the locomotive, and also for them restoring this engine and giving some of us younger guys a look at the thing we always wanted to see.
On behalf of the 470 Club, we'd like to thank the Conway Scenic Railroad for allowing us to work on this property, restore our locomotives, the F7s, this GP9 that we're on today. We'd like to thank the Mass Bay group for the generous grant we received to help fund this project. We'd also like to thank all of our, everyone that's donated to this project as well, through GoFundMes, through being a club member, and to the people that helped out and helped restore this along the way. We're also thankful for the railroads that worked for us, Heber Valley for coordinating this deal with us to obtain this locomotive, B&MRRHS Railways, St. Lawrence Atlantic, New Hampshire Central for helping move this, store this locomotive, New Hampshire North Coast for a donation they made towards this locomotive's restoration, and we're thankful for everybody that helped out.
Thanks again for watching, and if you'd like to participate towards the restoration of this and other locomotives, be sure to visit the 470 Railroad Club's Facebook page or their website. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video and other videos of ours, please consider heading over to our website and joining as a member or making a donation. It's your support that helps continue the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society's operations and continue bringing you videos and content like this. Members of the Society enjoy the printed newsletter 6 times a year, as well as our magazines, the B&M Bulletin and Highliner, which come out periodically throughout the year. Members can also volunteer to join multiple committees and really get engaged with the history of the Boston and Maine Railroad and preserving its legacy into the future.